As I sit here, approaching my 70th birthday at the end of the year, I wonder why I should be so concerned to investigate, with an enormous amount of effort and trouble, the history of my life and the life of my families. So I'd like to try and tease out what I'm attempting in a new project which I started a few months before I retired from Cambridge University. This is a project to reconstruct the history of the British Empire through the archives of a single family, my own family. Obviously I could have done many other things. I could have gone on writing general books, I could have travelled, spent time with my family, garden, do the sort of things one does after a busy academic life. But instead, while doing all those things in moderation, I'm also engaged with my wife Sarah in reconstructing this family saga of empire. Why do this? Well, a clue, because I don't really understand, of course, is in something I remember from my childhood. I seem to have been interested in the evocation of memory from an early period in my life. From about 15, I think, I had the idea that I would try to keep, and then one day use, an archive of my own life and my relatives' lives. So I hoarded toys, photographs, letters, writing, anything I could, and put them into boxes around my room in the Lake District. This desire to hold on to the past, to document it, document life as it went along so that I could reconstruct it, probably had many other sources. One might be that I was living in near Hawkshead, where Wordsworth had been a boy, and I'd already encountered his poetry, and particularly his autobiographical poetry in the prelude. Also the fact that I'd noticed my grandmother and mother hoarding documents and papers. So there were other influences as well. Whatever it was, it's clear that I had this feeling, and it's influenced me for the rest of my life. And it's partly reflected in perhaps the best essay I wrote at school, certainly the only one that ever won a distinction, called The Past. And here's the first paragraph. And just to repeat that, an essay called The Past, and here's the first paragraph. Written at about 1718, I wrote, "People often find tremendous pleasure in reliving the pleasures of past events. Partly, as I have already explained, because they are surveying it from a safe peak of knowledge. It is only when we are not fully conscious, however, that we can be truly transported there again and feel every emotion that we once felt. We must not worship the past. It is dangerous to idealize it and useless to live continually in it. It can be utilized as a springboard to the future, and for those who have had an unhappy life, it may be the dim backcloth to the glorious future, but that is all." The end of the essay, which was recommended for a distinction, there's a comment by my teacher in red ink. "One angle left out, the aged. What does it feel like, I wonder, when all the major experiences of one's life lie in the past, the sole adventure left, death? As I read this 50 years on and approaching that last adventure, it seems a pertinent remark. So what this is about is what Wordsworth characterized as a feature of poetry: emotion recollected in tranquility. And it's also about a remark of Kierkegaard's, which I think sums it up really. You can only understand life backwards, but we must live it forwards. So I've got to try and understand it backwards. One attempt to try and explain what I'm setting out to do, why I'm doing it, is in the preface to my first book in this venture, Dorset Days. I suggest that there are 4 questions behind this account of my childhood from the age of 5 to 13. One concerns who I was in that time and how did I come to be as I am now. This is the autobiographical quest which lies behind, I suppose, most autobiographies. The quest for personal roots and identity. I hope to throw some light on the wider experience, not just of myself, but the evolution of a certain kind of middle-class English male in the middle of the 20th century. A second question concerns my family and its history. It seems that I come from a rather well-documented and interesting family whose tentacles spread across the world and can be traced in detail from the later 17th century onwards. In particular, there are sets of letters and memoranda which give an insight into the inner dynamics of colonial family life all around the world, from Jamaica to Burma to China to India to Australia, South America. And not the least of these are my own mother's letters and other writings, which I hope to reassemble and expand. So this is the genealogical quest, if you like. A third question concerns England and Britain. I came back from India when I was 6, or rather 5, and encountered a new land. I needed to start to understand its distinctive history and culture. This is an exploration which I have really engaged in from that age of 5 up to the present, both as a historian and an anthropologist. The theme here is what I sometimes refer to as the peculiarity of the English, or the British, and what its causes and effects have been. Perhaps my best known encapsulation of this is in my book The Origins of English Individualism, written in 1977. But it goes on through to my latest book on Reflections on Cambridge in 2009. So much of my work has been exploring the bundle of contradictions and strange cultural patterns of this small island. Through examining my family and myself, I hope to throw further light on this. My final question, as I saw it at the beginning of the Dorset book, concerns the British Empire. Britain was just the small hub of a great empire for more than a century. The British created the empire, but equally it created Britain. The empire has a very distinctive character, which makes it different from other empires in the way it worked and imagined itself. I'm particularly interested in what held it together and how the identity of those who were involved with it, such as my own ancestors, was constructed. This knits together the three previous questions: my own education for empire, the experience of my far-flung family, and the peculiarity of their British home, and how all this was shaped by and shaped the British Empire. So, as I said, as I approached retirement from teaching at Cambridge in March 2009, I sat down to see if I could achieve this ambition of reconstructing this past, and I thought I would start with my own family life. But I was still not sure, and I'm still not sure, why I should wish to undertake this laborious journey. It might be, I suppose, because as a professional historian, I wanted to understand this great empire and the changes of the post-war years in England, a social history. It might be that as an anthropologist who was aware that the early years of life, from birth to 13, largely determine a person's character and the rest of their life, I should be interested in this period. I'd done studies of childhood in my own family, my grandchildren, and in Nepal, and I'd seen how much of our character is formed by the age of 12 or 13. What about myself? Another anthropological urging might have been, or intuition, might have been that boarding schools, which I attended from 8 to 18, and particularly the interesting Dragon School in Oxford, have those characteristics which make them particularly suitable for anthropological analysis. They're bounded to a certain extent. They are whole, integrated, what anthropologists call holistic communities, where everything is mixed together. And this makes them an ideal subject for the intensive participation and observation method of anthropology. Perhaps another thing which urged me on was that, having finished my book on reflections on Cambridge University, or Cambridge, and in 2009, I'd become more and more aware that Oxford and Cambridge are analytically inseparable from the public and boarding school systems. To understand one part of the process, the universities, one has to understand the whole. Perhaps another reason was that as an English social historian, I was increasingly aware that English boarding schools were one of the most central, indicative forms of social life in England. Like English law, they told you a great deal about the rest of English culture and civilization. They're very ancient, and they encapsulate much that interested me about England. Perhaps another reason was that I've spent much of my life travelling, particularly spending long periods in Nepal, and more recently in Japan and specifically in China. And I can see there, as obviously one sees in America, the huge influence of English educational models and how they are, even now, shaping our world, particularly in China. A specific sort of pressure was being asked to write a paper in a volume which was being assembled for my senior friend and colleague, Professor André Betaille. He had started writing his autobiography, and so his junior colleagues decided it'd be nice to present a set of anthropological childhoods to him on his birthday. And I sat down and wrote this little half-fun piece called Anthropologists, Dragons and Hobbits, which was about the Dragon School, and I really enjoyed it and put a few pictures in, and that set me thinking, well, shall I do some more of this? Because I learnt a lot in doing it. More philosophically and more widely, perhaps my reason for trying to understand myself in time and my own trajectory was that I've had a long-term interest in trying to understand what our modern world is like, how it works, what its central quintessence, what its patterns are, and in particular how, in a way that is very unusual in history, it's separated out the spheres of our life, the economy, the politics, the religion, the society are separated out and kept in tension with each other. This has been given many terms by thinkers, for example T.S. Eliot, the disassociation of sensibility, or Max Weber, the disenchantment of the world, but it's always interested me because obviously I have lived it in my own experience. So I had a desire to examine my own life and how this had happened and what it means for us all, as part of a larger process which recently I developed into a set of lectures for a Chinese audience and being published in China, called The Invention of the Modern World. Perhaps another thing that urged me on, because there are many factors, was the presence in my barn at home of the very large set of family archives left me mainly by my grandmother and mother, which needed to be put into some shape. I knew that they were valuable, that they should be deposited in archives, but in themselves, in a jumble and uncatalogued and unsorted and unexplained more generally and integrated, they would be largely wasted. So I should go through them and sort them out and comment on them. And I was particularly struck by the discovery of the richness of my own mother's letters to me and to her husband and to her other children, also her diaries and many unpublished writings, poetry and so on, from her childhood onwards. And I felt I should do something with this, as she had often hoped. Another, coming back to a theoretical interest, was a growing realization that the English family system and its educational system, which is so unusual, is what created the imagined community, using the well-known term from Benedict Anderson, or rather, as I call it, the imagined empire, because it's not just a community of a nation, as Anderson wrote, but the whole British Empire. How this family education system shaped this imagined empire and continues to shape it today. I became, as I wrote about the subject and investigated, increasingly aware that without the pattern of sending children home to boarding schools from Jamaica and India, as my family did and other families did, and then sending them out again to trade and administer this expanding empire. Without that mechanism, the British Empire could not have existed in the form it did. It's what held it together, an imagined world created in schooling and university. So which of these theories works best to explain what I've done? Well, I don't think any of them do. They're all part of the story, and there are no doubt other reasons as well. But certainly inquisitiveness, curiosity, wonder, and a desire to understand are behind it all. Yet it's one thing to want to live one's life for the second time, another joy of all this. One lives it once and then lives it a second time in one's understanding, as Wordsworth did in the Prelude. But is it possible? How are we going to do it? Because it isn't easy.